Thank you all for coming. I, as a lifetime human rights activist, I'm especially excited to be talking about Bayard Rustin because, as you can see in his collected letters, and as I'd like to ask Michael to talk about, he was really the, in some ways, sole voice in the civil rights movement who really saw a complete set of linkages between all forms of injustice. And you know, there's a very sad story of the split between civil rights and human rights in the United States that actually the Schomburg Center is going to be looking at in an upcoming event on March 30th, and which is certainly the subject of a whole other discussion. But it's one of the things that's very inspiring as in his story is that he saw so clearly that indignity and injustice against African Americans was connected to the discrimination and the struggles, this discrimination against so many voices. And so I was wondering if you could start off by talking a little bit about what brought you to his story. Tell us more about him and what makes him so compelling and so exciting as a figure.
Sure. First, let me say that it's great to be with all of you, and it's especially great to be near the Schomburg archives. I have used the archives so many times. So many thanks to the Schomburg archives for assisting me in my research along the way. Indeed, I agree. I try to let my projects arise organically, one from another. And so early on, when I was studying Martin Luther King Jr., there was Bayard Rustin. And then later, when I was studying Jackie Robinson, there was Bayard Rustin. And then when I was studying Thurgood Marshall, and the early Thurgood Marshall I'm talking about, the one who was the NAACP attorney, there was Bayard Rustin. And it was pretty easy for me to target him because he was all over the place, and he was such a fascinating character. To me, he's especially fascinating because he brings together so many of my interests. He brings together civil rights, human rights, progressive religion, gay rights, nonviolence and pacifism, and the list goes on. So there we have, in one person, so many of these rights coming together. And Mila's right to know that Bayard really saw the linkages between discrimination and prejudice in ways that I think a lot of other civil rights leaders missed. And he did partly because of who he was. He was somebody who was African American and openly gay and a pacifist and a socialist with roots in the Young Communist League. And again, the list goes on from there. So he understood the linkages of prejudice and discrimination, partly because of his own cultural and socio-political identity.
Mm-hmm. When I was looking at, after reading the fantastic collection of letters that you have, as I was looking for other information about Bayard, I made the mistake of starting with academic sources. And as you know, he isn't well studied compared to so many of the other figures, everyone you just mentioned, the much more household names from the civil rights movement. But then, of course, I went to the right place, which was the children's librarian of the New York Public Library, who I was chatting with and who mentioned that there's a young adult, a children's story, a biography of Bayard Rustin, which is pretty recent, and is a really good story. We were just looking at it before. But in it, I found that he has a poem that he wrote in high school where he says, "I ask of you no shining gold, I seek not epitaph or fame, no monument of stone for me, for man need never speak my name." And I thought that was fitting because in a way that's his story, is about not having chosen the spotlight in the movement, having been behind the scenes in so many ways and having been a great leader, but not taking the public role that someone like Martin Luther King took. Can you talk a little bit about his role in the movement and maybe how he made those choices about what he wanted his role to be?
Sure. First, let me say it's great to see Bayard in a book for children and youth, especially because he felt deeply about children. There's some great pictures of Bayard with children, especially refugee children, and there are also some great images of Bayard singing with them. So I'm really pleased to see this. And I wasn't aware of the resource as exactly as I could have been before, but I'm going to check it out after I leave here. Now, yes, indeed, Bayard was not studied for a long time. There's no doubt about that. And a couple reasons I think come into play. He did not have a natural base or constituency. So unlike Adam Clayton Powell Jr. here of Harlem, he didn't have a base of voters to draw from. He didn't have a civil rights organization early on. So he wasn't like Roy Wilkins of the NAACP or Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP. And he didn't emerge and form an organization early on like Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC. So he didn't have those organizational or electoral bases to tap into. Another reason comes into play, and that is that Rustin was openly gay for his era. And for that reason, he decided, well, let me add another point. He was also arrested on charges of lewd vagrancy at different points. And so those who were civil rights leaders, as well as Bayard himself, chose at different times for him to step into the shadows. And he did that sometimes willingly and sometimes not willingly. Bayard also, I want to emphasize, was a great speaker. Early on, he was known for his ability to be a great speaker. And that ability faded into the background as these arrests happened and as people became concerned about his sexuality tainting the movement, about his arrest tainting the movement, and also about his roots in communism tainting the movement as well. And so his speaking abilities went to the background, and as that happened, his tactical abilities came to the foreground. And as a tactician, he was behind the scenes, in a sense, directing the players on the stage. And the players were Martin Luther King Jr. and Roy Wilkins and others. So he was directing them, but he was the man who was behind the scenes, like our technical folks here tonight.
Can you talk us through some of those examples of his brilliance as a tactician? I mean, he was clearly deeply appreciated by the civil rights movement in that way, and then he was sorely missed when he stepped back, in part because of concerns about being publicly identified as gay and possibly doing damage to the movement. Martin Luther King, for a while, distanced himself from him. But throughout the book, we can see in several different ways, in several different movements, we can see his brilliance as a strategist, starting from the beginning when he's imprisoned for conscientious objection to World War II, and he's organizing the prisoners in the prison, on to the planning of what was a precursor of the Freedom Rides 10 years before Rosa Parks, to the planning of the March on Washington. Can you talk us through some of those, how that's reflected in the letters, and how you kind of told that story of his his tactics?
Sure. His tactical ability is really present in his prison letters, where he's directing his fellow inmates to stand against segregation in federal prison, both at Ashland and then later at Lewisburg. And he maps out careful strategies. And not only does he do it for his inmates, he does it for the warden there as well, which is excellent. He tells the warden exactly what he's going to do, and then he gets the inmates to do it. And the letters are really striking because they go through such detail. His tactical abilities are really evident, you're right, in 1947 when he's directing the Journey of Reconciliation. And these were really the first Freedom Riders. These were the folks, and all of them were male at that point, who decided to test the Irene Morgan versus Virginia decision that criminalized segregation laws for interstate travelers. And so they tested the Supreme Court decision by taking a bus trip through the South. And Bayard and George Hauser were really the main strategists there. And the memos they put together are absolutely breathtaking for their detail and for the concrete ways they directed people at different points. They had everything mapped out carefully. So it's absolutely stunning to me. Now, I also want to add that Bayard had thought about marches on Washington long before that 1963 March on Washington. Indeed, the book includes a long memo. I think it's 14 pages